What if we imagine the islands of Malta not as they are today, but as they were thousands of years ago, when people first placed their hands on soft limestone and began shaping it into something lasting? The sea was already there, endless and surrounding, but the land was simpler, quieter, with fewer layers of human presence. When we speak of Malta, we mean small stretches of stone rising from the Mediterranean, places that can be crossed on foot in hours rather than days. This smallness is important. It framed the rhythm of life, the scale of effort, the limits of what could be done. Now we will gently linger on this land itself, because without the islands, the temples could not exist. Malta's bedrock is limestone, a kind of sedimentary stone. In simple terms, limestone is what happens when countless small shells and marine creatures, pressed together over millions of years, turn into solid rock. It is both fragile and strong, soft when newly cut, harder once exposed to air. Imagine a block of cheese that stiffens after it dries in the sun. This was the material available to the first builders, and it shaped what they could do. The islands lie between Sicily and North Africa, a stepping stone in the wide sea. This position meant that the land was never completely cut off. Winds, currents, and boats connected Malta to larger stories, even when its own scale remained modest. But we must pause here. We cannot know exactly how isolated or connected the first islanders felt. Archaeological finds give us hints, traces of imported stone, tools, or seeds, but no direct voices. We must remain careful, aware that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Still, the position of Malta offers a reasonable frame, an in-between place, touched by many directions, yet with its own closed circle. The landscape itself carries signs of deep time. In the cliffs, we see fossils of marine life, reminders that what feels like solid ground was once sea floor. In the soil, thin and easily eroded, we see why farming was fragile and why stone, more than earth, became the enduring medium of human work. For the people who lived here, the land was both gift and limit, fertile in small patches, but quickly exhausted, rich in stone, but demanding effort to shape. If we think slowly, we can picture how the first settlers moved across this land. Their paths left no maps, but we can sense them in traces. Pollen preserved in sediments, showing what they planted. Animal bones buried in layers telling us what they ate. The charred wood of ancient fires, marking where they gathered. These are the indirect signals, the faint handwriting of a vanished presence. If we imagine a simple experiment, we can place ourselves in their cycle of days. Step 1. A family lands on the shore, bringing goats, grains, and small tools. Step 2. They walk the island, testing the soil, noticing the soft stone. Step 3. Over generations, they realize the stone can be shaped, can hold form longer than wood or clay. In this slow unfolding, the foundation of temples is already present, not as a sudden decision, but as an accumulation of possibilities. What remains unclear is how these communities thought of their land. Did they see it as permanent home or as a station between journeys? We do not know. The traces we hold are neutral: pollen, bones, stones. Interpretation comes from us, with all our caution. Yet even in this uncertainty, one thing feels steady. The land itself guided their choices. It offered limestone that could be carved, soil that required careful tending, and horizons of sea that defined limits. When we look at Malta today, busy with roads and towns, it is easy to forget how small and bare it once was. But the temples remind us. They anchor us to that earlier scale. to a landscape where stone and sea were the dominant presences. As we rest with this thought, we can sense how deeply the land itself shaped the story. The temples are not just structures placed on Malta. They are extensions of Malta, carved from its body, aligned with its contours. Their endurance is not only the work of people, but also of the island that held them. And so we pause here, in quiet recognition, before we move further into the story. What if we picture the islands of Malta as quiet stepping stones, resting in the middle of a wide blue sea? Small fragments of land where journeys pause and stories take root. In scale, these islands are modest, only a few kilometers across, but in time, they stretch far back, carrying layers of history pressed into their stone. When we speak of Malta, we are speaking of a landscape made almost entirely of limestone, a kind of rock born from the remains of ancient seas. This is not a land of mountains or forests, but of soft rolling hills, terraced fields, and cliffs that meet the water. To understand the temples, we must first rest with the islands themselves, because they are the stage on which everything unfolded. The Mediterranean Sea is often imagined as a great crossroads, and Malta sits near its center, between Sicily to the north and the coast of North Africa to the south. This location gave the islands both isolation and connection. On the one hand, the sea formed a boundary, a protective ring that limited what people could carry in or out. On the other hand, winds and currents made Malta part of larger routes, a natural pause for those who traveled. It is difficult to know exactly how often those routes were taken in such early times, but the geography itself suggests that Malta was never fully cut off. The land is shaped by limestone in many layers. Limestone is formed over millions of years, when shells and tiny sea creatures accumulate on the ocean floor, harden, and rise as stone. In Malta, the entire foundation of the islands is made from this material. It can be soft when freshly cut, almost like compacted chalk. But once exposed, it grows harder, resisting time. This dual quality made it central to the story of the builders. They did not have to look far for material. The very ground they walked on was the substance from which temples would rise. Now we can pause for a moment on the soil. Malta's soil is thin and fragile. Farming required care, rotation, and patience. If worked too hard, the earth would quickly lose fertility. This delicate balance between land and food supply influenced the size of communities, their rhythm of life, and their need for cooperation. Where the soil was light, stone was heavy, enduring, and abundant. Sooner or later, people turned to stone as the more permanent medium. Yet we must remain careful here. The records we have are indirect. Pollen grains buried in lake sediments show us what was grown. Charcoal layers reveal ancient fires. Bones mark which animals lived alongside people. These are not voices, but traces. They tell us something, but never everything. The absence of certain crops or tools does not mean they were unknown. It only means they left no trace that we have found. This is why we move slowly, balancing what is visible with what is uncertain. If we try a small mental experiment, we can imagine how the islands may have shaped choices. Step 1. A group arrives by boat, landing on a rocky shore. They find an island with little forest, thin soil, and abundant stone. Step 2. They settle, planting crops, tending goats or sheep, shaping tools from what they find. They soon notice that the stone is soft enough to carve, yet strong enough to last. Step 3. As generations pass, they realize that stone can be not only shelter, but also symbol, a way to mark continuity across time. In this way, the land itself becomes teacher and partner, guiding what can and cannot be done. The island's position also shaped its openness. Too small to hold great numbers, Malta encouraged tight-knit groups, communities that relied on shared effort. Too far from large mainlands, it discouraged easy exchange, which meant that skills and traditions developed in their own rhythm. Yet because of its placement, new ideas sometimes arrived, carried by boats or drifted with people. This dual character, isolated yet connected, remains part of Malta's mystery. The language of stone carries this history. Fossils locked into cliffs show us that the land once lay beneath the sea. Terraces carved into hillsides tell us how people managed scarce soil. Deep ruts worn into rock by ancient carts suggest movement of heavy loads. Each of these is a fragment of memory, written not in words but in shapes and marks. They are the quiet archive of the islands themselves. When we look at Malta through this lens, the temples appear less like isolated monuments and more like extensions of the land. They are limestone, shaped into form, responding to the same qualities that guided farming, settlement, and travel. They are both product and reflection of the island. We may not know the exact thoughts of those who lived here, but we can sense the framework they worked within. Small space, fragile soil, abundant stone, and the endless sea. And so, as we rest with the image of Malta, we see it not only as background, but as actor in its own right. The land, the stone, the thin soils, and the open horizons shaped choices and possibilities. They gave the builders both limits and opportunities. The temples, in the end, are part of this dialogue between people and island, between patience and endurance. And with that, we pause, holding the quiet shape of Malta in our thoughts before we gently move further into the unfolding story. What if we imagine the first moment when human feet touched the shores of Malta, carrying not only bodies, but memories, tools, and small bundles of seeds? The islands were empty of people before, shaped only by wind, stone, and sea. Then, somewhere around the 6th millennium before our era, groups began to arrive. They came by boat, crossing waters that might feel vast to us now, but to them were familiar pathways. Boats in those times were simple, perhaps made of wood and reeds, sealed with resins. They could not hold many passengers, but they carried enough: families, animals, grain, and the tools of daily life. The sea was not barrier, but bridge. And these people made the crossing, leaving behind traces of their passage only in what they built and what they left behind in the soil. Now we pause for a moment to think about why they came. The reasons are not fully known. Perhaps the search for new land to farm. Perhaps the pressure of growing numbers in nearby regions. Or perhaps curiosity, the human desire to step beyond the horizon. The truth is hidden from us, but the result is clear. Malta became a place of settlement, where people lived, planted, raised animals, and slowly began to shape stone. Evidence for these first arrivals comes not from direct records, but from indirect signs. Archaeologists have found pottery fragments, tools made of flint, bones of domesticated animals such as goats and sheep. Flint itself is not native to Malta, which suggests that these early people either brought it with them or maintained contact with nearby lands. In the soil layers, we find grains of wheat and barley, proof that farming had begun. Charcoal shows that they cleared patches of land, using fire to open space for fields. These small details, fragile as dust, are our window into their lives. We must remain careful. The absence of certain tools or crops does not mean they were unknown. It may simply mean that evidence has not survived the long passage of time. The traces are like faint lines on worn parchment, readable only in fragments. If we try a gentle thought experiment, we can step into their rhythm. Step 1. A family lands on Malta, bringing goats that provide milk, meat, and hides. They tether the animals near a patch of grass, while others clear small plots for crops. Step 2. Seeds of barley and wheat are planted. Days become weeks, weeks become seasons. Some plants thrive, others fail in the thin soil. Step 3. After years, fields and herds establish a fragile balance, enough to support a growing community. The land becomes familiar, its limits understood. The cycle of planting and harvesting, tending and resting, repeats like the steady breath of life. These early settlers lived in simple structures, perhaps made of wood, reeds, and stone. No grand buildings yet, only shelters against wind and rain. But in time, their attention turned to stone, in a deeper way. The limestone was abundant, easy to cut when fresh. It may have begun with small walls, storage pits, or platforms. Slowly, the knowledge of stone's properties grew, until it became part of their culture, their way of shaping permanence out of impermanence. Now we return for a moment to what we do not know. We do not know the words these people spoke. We do not know their names, their songs, their stories. We only know what remains in material form. Yet even silence is meaningful. The lack of written record means that memory is carried through layers of soil, through marks on tools, through the alignment of stones. The past speaks softly, but it speaks. The first arrivals did not build temples immediately. That came later, across centuries. But without them, there would be no foundation for what followed. They brought the knowledge of farming, the habit of shaping tools, the patience of living with limits. In this way, they planted not only seeds of grain, but seeds of culture. Their legacy is quiet, but enduring. We can imagine them watching the horizon, aware of the sea around them. Perhaps they felt both safe and enclosed. The sea protected them from easy invasion, but it also meant they were bound to what the island offered. This balance of isolation and connection would define Malta's story. The traces of those first steps are still with us, hidden in soil layers, preserved in bone, captured in fragments of pottery. They are not dramatic, not monumental, but they are the first whispers of a story that would unfold into stone temples older than pyramids. And so we rest with this thought, that the first arrivals brought with them not only tools and seeds, but also the beginnings of a dialogue with the land. A dialogue that, over centuries, would grow into temples of enduring stone. We hold this quiet continuity in mind, knowing that every grand structure begins with small, almost invisible beginnings. And we pause here before moving gently onward. What if we pause for a moment and think of stone not simply as lifeless matter, but as a material that changes with time, like dough that stiffens or clay that dries? The builders of Malta lived in a land where limestone was everywhere, lying close to the surface, ready to be touched, cut, and shaped. To them, stone was not an abstract concept. It was the ground beneath their feet, the walls of their homes, the foundation of their fields. Understanding how this stone behaved was the beginning of everything that followed. Limestone is formed over long ages. It begins as the remains of tiny sea creatures, shells, and corals, that settle on the seabed. Layer upon layer, pressed by the weight of water, they fuse into rock. When lifted above the sea, the stone becomes land. In Malta, almost the entire island is made of this material. It is soft when freshly cut, almost like compressed chalk. But once it is exposed to the air, it hardens, becoming firm and lasting. We can think of it as bread crust forming when dough meets heat. This property made limestone both manageable and durable, a rare combination that allowed people to build with confidence. Now we can gently notice the traces that show how this stone was worked. Archaeologists have found cut marks on blocks, small grooves where tools pressed again and again. These marks are not random scratches. They are steady, repeated strokes, the rhythm of human hands carving into rock. Tools were not of metal, for this was before the time of bronze or iron. Instead, they used stone against stone, flint chisels, and even hard pebbles as hammers. It may seem slow to us, but patience was the true tool. Little by little, blocks emerged, shaped enough to fit, yet still massive and heavy. The limits of our knowledge lie in what is missing. Wooden levers, ropes, and platforms, if they were used, did not survive. Wood rots, fibers decay, and what remains is only the stone itself, too silent to reveal the full story. We can only infer, imagining techniques from indirect hints. Grooves in the ground may show where blocks were dragged. Circular depressions might have been post holes for wooden supports. These are not final answers, only possibilities, glimpses of vanished practices. Now for a brief thought experiment, let us walk alongside the builders. Step 1. They notice a ledge of limestone, newly exposed, soft under a tool. They begin to cut, shaping rough blocks. Step 2. These blocks are set aside, left in the air. Over weeks, they harden, gaining strength. Step 3. Later, the blocks are carried to a chosen place, aligned into walls. With each step, stone moves from the earth into form, from raw material into memory. The language of stone is patient. Fossils inside limestone remind us of seas that once covered the land. Tool marks on surfaces remind us of hands that worked slowly and carefully. Weathering patterns tell us how long blocks have stood under sun and rain. All these signals form an archive, written not on paper, but in texture and surface. When studied closely, they tell us both what was possible and what was beyond reach. We must remain cautious. The absence of wheel tracks does not mean no wheel transport was known. The absence of pulleys does not mean lifting was impossible. What we have are traces, partial and fragile, demanding humility in our interpretations. Still, the endurance of these temples shows that the knowledge of stone was deep. The builders understood not just how to cut, but how to set blocks so they would last, how to balance weight and void, how to create spaces that did not collapse. This is knowledge gained not in a single generation, but through long practice, handed down in actions rather than words. The stone itself carries this continuity, shaped by many hands across centuries. If we return for a moment to the islands themselves, we can see how natural conditions encouraged this intimacy with stone. Soil was thin and easily eroded. Wood was scarce, and trees grew small. But limestone was abundant, almost inexhaustible. It became the natural medium of permanence, the element through which people spoke across time. In this way, Malta's temples are less about sudden invention and more about slow deepening of a relationship between people and their land. And so we rest with this understanding. That stone in Malta was not only material, but teacher, guiding choices and methods. The softness of fresh limestone, the firmness of aged blocks, the patience required to work it. These shaped the rhythm of construction. The temples that endure are silent proof of this dialogue. Carved from the earth itself, hardened in the air, and lasting beyond the lives of those who made them. We pause here, holding this quiet picture of stone as partner, before we continue our gentle path forward. What if we imagine stepping into one of the ancient stone temples, not as they stand today, in fragments and ruins, but as they might have looked when newly built, whole and enclosing. The shapes greet us not with straight lines or sharp corners, but with curves that open like petals, or like shells unfolding in a slow spiral. These were not narrow rooms, but broad chambers, rounded and connected, flowing one into another. In their design, there is softness, a rhythm closer to natural forms than to rigid geometry. The walls, carved from limestone, would have risen smoothly, enclosing spaces where light entered carefully, through openings that face the sun. Now we pause on this point of shape, because it tells us something. The builders of Malta did not follow the square and rectangular designs that later civilizations favored. Instead, they worked with circles and ellipses, with chambers connected like the rooms of a hive. Some archaeologists call them lobes, each one opening into the next. Together, they form a plan that resembles a flower, or a body with arms extended. This does not mean we know the exact meaning, but the choice of rounded forms was consistent, repeated over centuries, suggesting a shared vision passed from generation to generation. The mechanisms of construction were simple in principle, but demanding in practice. Stones were cut and placed to form curved walls, each block supporting the next, the weight distributed in arcs. The builders understood, even without writing or mathematics, how to balance pressures so that the walls stood firm. Roofs may have been made of horizontal slabs, or perhaps wooden beams covered with reeds and clay. Much of that has vanished, leaving only the stone foundations and walls. But the surviving shapes are enough to suggest the spaces were enclosed, protective, and carefully arranged. We do not know for certain why this particular design was chosen. Was it for practical reasons, to support the heavy stone roofs? Was it symbolic, reflecting ideas of cycles, of continuity, of community? Or was it simply a style that felt right, comfortable, and meaningful? The evidence does not speak directly, so we must stay cautious, aware of the limits of what can be claimed. What we can read is the language of traces. The placement of doorways shows us how movement was guided, often from a central courtyard into inner rooms. The alignment of entrances with the rising sun suggests that light was important, marking times of day or seasons. The curves of the walls soften sound, perhaps shaping the acoustics of speech or chant. These are indirect markers, but together they whisper of intentionality, of design with purpose. If we follow a small thought experiment, we can step into such a space. Step 1. Morning light enters through a narrow passage, striking the floor of a chamber, while the rest remains in shadow. Step 2. A group of people gathers in the central room, their voices low, the sound deepening as it echoes gently in curved walls. Step 3. The chambers around them remain empty or quiet, like side petals of a flower, holding space, potential, and silence. In this way, the shape of the building guides the experience of those within it, shaping both perception and memory. The scale of these structures is also telling. Though built of heavy blocks, the rooms are not towering or vast. They are human-scaled, intimate, made to be entered, not simply admired from afar. This suggests that the temples were places of gathering, not just monuments. Their shapes, enclosing and curved, may have emphasized inclusion, drawing people inward, creating a sense of shared presence. Still, we must resist projecting too much certainty. The absence of written records means that meanings remain open. The shapes may have been purely functional, or they may have carried symbolic weight. What remains clear is that the builders invested centuries of effort into repeating these forms, refining them, expanding them, showing continuity of tradition across generations. The language of stone here is soft, yet steady. Each curve, each chamber, each passage speaks of an architectural vision that was neither random nor temporary. The fact that so many temples share this rounded, petal-like design tells us that the form itself mattered deeply, even if we do not know exactly why. It was a choice repeated again and again, across time and across sites. When we hold this image in our minds, we can feel the rhythm of the builder's thoughts. They lived in a world of cycles: the turning of seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the growth and decay of crops, the repetition of birth and death. Perhaps the curves of their temples echoed these cycles. Perhaps they simply reflected the softness of the land and the stone itself. We cannot decide with certainty. But the endurance of these shapes tells us they held meaning, both practical and profound. And so we pause here, with the gentle picture of rounded chambers, stone petals, opening one into another, a language of architecture that still whispers across thousands of years. We rest in that quiet flow of form before moving softly onward. What if we let ourselves drift for a moment into the flow of time, counting not in decades or centuries, but in the quiet rhythm of millennia? The temples of Malta are older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge. When we whisper such numbers, 5,000 years or more, they feel almost beyond reach, like distant stars. Yet these numbers are not empty. They are drawn from careful measures, from traces locked in charcoal, bone, and soil. They tell us that the people of Malta were shaping stone into great forms at a time when much of the world still lived in small, scattered groups. To place ourselves in this time, we can imagine the wider world of the 4th millennium before our era. Metal was not yet common. Writing had not begun. Great empires were still centuries away. But in Malta, communities were already investing generations of effort into stone monuments. This makes the temples among the earliest known examples of large-scale building by settled people. It is not a competition, not a race to be first, but it is a reminder of how deep these roots are. Now let us pause for a moment to consider how we know such things. Radiocarbon dating is the main tool. When living things, plants, animals, people, die, small traces of carbon within them begin to change at a steady rate. By measuring what remains, scientists can estimate when that life ended. Charcoal from fires, seeds from crops, bones from meals, all become quiet clocks of the past. In Malta, these clocks point again and again to ages over 5,000 years. This is why we can say with care that the temples are older than pyramids, even while knowing that our estimates carry margins of uncertainty. The absence of exact calendars means that we work with ranges, not single points. A temple may be from around 3600 BCE, give or take a century or two. For human memory, such uncertainty feels small. For scientific precision, it matters. This is why we speak gently, never with absolute finality. The language of traces also includes layers of soil. When archaeologists dig carefully, they peel back floors built on earlier floors, ashes beneath stones, offerings placed and then covered. Each layer is like a page in a book, but some pages are torn, others faded. Reading this book is slow and partial, but still it yields patterns. We see that building began in small ways, then grew larger, then ceased. The span of time is more than 1,000 years, long enough for entire cultures to rise and fade. Let us try a quiet thought experiment to feel this duration. Step 1. A small community begins to shape limestone, building simple enclosures. Their children grow up, inherit the task, expand the work. Step 2. Centuries later, new chambers are added, larger and more refined, as knowledge deepens. Generations pass, each one seeing the temple not as ancient, but as present, part of daily life. Step 3. After many hundreds of years, building slows, then stops. The people who began the work are long forgotten, their names gone, but the stones remain, holding memory beyond memory. This is the weight of time the temples carry. Now we can rest for a moment with the thought of endurance. To us, the difference between 4,000 and 5,000 years may seem abstract, but to stone, it is the difference between sharp edges and worn ones, between carved surfaces and softened forms. Rain, wind, and sun have worked on these structures for millennia, yet still they stand. This endurance is itself a kind of message, not of intention, but of survival. What remains unclear is how the builders themselves understood time. Did they imagine their work lasting forever? Did they see it as a gift to future generations? Or was it simply for the present, for rituals and gatherings, without thought of distant centuries? We cannot know. The temples may have been meant for continuity, or they may simply have endured beyond expectation. The absence of written records leaves us without their perspective. But the traces we do hold, the size of stones, the care of placement, the repeated rebuilding, suggest that longevity was valued, even if forever was not imagined. As we let these reflections settle, we see that the weight of time is both a fact and a feeling. Fact, in the sense that dates can be measured, layers can be read, centuries can be counted. Feeling, in the sense that standing among these stones gives us a sense of continuity, of touching something beyond our own lifespan. The temples remind us that human effort can reach across thousands of years, even without writing, even without empires. And so we pause here, gently aware of the scale of time, of the patience of stone, and of the people who once shaped it, before we move softly further into the unfolding story. What if we lean closer to the stones and listen not to their silence, but to the faint marks left upon them, like handwriting pressed into paper long ago? The temples of Malta carry thousands of such small traces, reminders of the tools that once shaped them. To speak of these tools is to step into a world before metal, when cutting and carving relied only on what was at hand: stone, bone, wood. It may sound fragile to us, but with patience and time, even such simple means proved enough to move mountains, one stroke at a time. We should pause briefly on the idea of stone tools. Flint, a hard and sharp variety of stone, was prized for cutting edges. It is not native to Malta, which tells us something important. Either the people carried flint with them when they arrived, or they maintained contact with other regions to obtain it. This detail, small as it seems, already hints at connection beyond the islands. Alongside flint, harder limestone itself could be shaped into pounding tools. Bones, when dried and sharpened, served for scraping or fine carving. Wood may have been used for levers or handles, though no examples survive. These implements were modest, yet in steady human hands, they left their marks on the heavy blocks. The language of these marks is still visible. Shallow grooves, parallel lines, rounded indentations. Each is the memory of a tool pressed against stone. In some places we can see where a block was cut away from bedrock, the outline of the quarry face still preserved. In others, we find holes where wedges may have been placed to split rock. These are indirect signs, the quiet archaeology of effort. The tools themselves are often gone, but their fingerprints remain, embedded in the surfaces they touched. Now we must remain cautious. Because wood decays and bone crumbles, the full tool kit of the builders is hidden from us. What has survived tends to be stone, the most durable material. This does not mean no other tools existed. Absence of evidence is not proof of absence. We can only infer possibilities, guided by experiment and analogy with other ancient cultures. Some modern reconstructions, for example, show how heavy blocks can be cut and shaped with surprisingly simple tools, given enough patience. It is not speed that mattered, but continuity of work. Let us try a gentle thought experiment to see this in motion. Step 1. A group gathers at the quarry. One person strikes limestone with a flint chisel. Another holds the block steady. A third sharpens the tool as it dulls. Step 2. Hours pass, marks deepen. Small fragments fall away. The block slowly separates from the bedrock. Step 3. After days of repeated effort, the stone is freed, ready to be dragged, rolled, or carried toward the building site. Each stage is slow, but together they move mountains. The traces left behind are more than physical. They are also cultural signals. The presence of flint tells us about networks of exchange. The wear patterns on bones tell us about resource use. The location of quarries tells us about planning and choice. Every tool and every mark is a small data point, part of a larger archive, written not on paper, but into the land itself. If we step back for a moment, we see how these humble tools shaped more than stone. They shaped a relationship with time. Working with bone and flint requires acceptance of slowness, of repetition. This patience may have carried over into other parts of life, into farming, ritual, and community. The rhythm of striking stone might have echoed the rhythm of planting and harvesting, cycles of persistence rather than speed. Yet we should admit our limits. We do not know how many people worked, how long a single block took to cut, how tools were shared or stored. We can only guess, piecing together fragments from experiments and remains. The gaps in knowledge are as large as the stones themselves, but within the gaps, there is still a kind of quiet understanding that human hands, even with simple tools, could build what endures across 5,000 years. And so, as we rest with the image of chisels, scrapers, and pounding stones, we are reminded that greatness often begins with small and humble instruments. The temples do not speak of sudden leaps, but of steady persistence, of marks repeated until form emerges. These faint grooves in limestone, still visible in the half-light of Malta's sun, are perhaps the most direct signatures of the builders. They tell us, softly but clearly, that people once labored here, patiently and together, leaving traces that time could not erase. We pause here, holding this picture of simple tools and enduring marks, before moving gently onward. What if we let our thoughts rest on the image of immense stones, some weighing as much as small vehicles, moving slowly across the landscape of Malta? The people who shaped these temples faced not only the task of carving blocks, but also of transporting them from quarries to building sites, sometimes across uneven ground. Without wheels, without iron, they relied on steady methods, born from observation and repetition. To us, the challenge may seem overwhelming, yet to them, it was part of the rhythm of life, taken step by step. The context is important. The largest stones in the Maltese temples can weigh more than 20 tons. That is a weight we associate with machines, cranes, and engines. But these were moved thousands of years ago, long before such devices. How was it done? The simplest explanation lies in patience, cooperation, and the use of what was available. Ropes twisted from plant fibers, wooden rollers, levers, and perhaps sledges dragged over prepared paths. Each block may have taken days or weeks to move, but time itself was not scarce. The process worked because generations shared the effort, passing down techniques as quiet knowledge. Now we should pause on what we do not know. No ropes have survived. No sledges have been found intact. Wooden fibers decay quickly in Malta's climate. What we have instead are indirect signs. At some temple sites, deep grooves in bedrock suggest paths where stones were dragged. In other places, small round stones may have served as rollers. Marks on blocks themselves hint at how they were levered into place. None of this is final proof. It is a constellation of traces, allowing us to sketch the outlines of vanished methods. If we think in terms of the language of traces, the ground becomes an archive. In places where stones were moved, we find ruts carved into the limestone surface, still visible after thousands of years. In quarries, we see half-cut blocks, abandoned mid-process, as if workers stopped suddenly. These are like unfinished sentences, giving us insight into methods without telling the whole story. Even the wear on the edges of certain stones may reveal how they were dragged, chipped slightly by friction against the ground. Let us attempt a gentle mental experiment. Step 1. A block is cut loose from the quarry, still rough around the edges. Wooden levers are placed beneath it, and slowly, with teamwork, it is lifted onto logs. Step 2. Ropes are tied, and the block is pulled forward. As it moves, the logs behind it are carried to the front, reused again and again, creating a rolling pathway. Step 3. The block reaches the building site, where inclined planes of earth or smaller stones may have been used to raise it into position. The process is slow, but steady, like the movement of a tide. We cannot know if this was the exact method, but reconstructions suggest it is possible. Modern experiments using replicas of ancient tools have shown that small groups of people can move surprisingly heavy stones with patience. The builders of Malta, working as communities, could have achieved the same. Now we pause for a moment to note the humility required in such reconstructions. Experiments give us possibilities, not certainty. Perhaps other techniques were used that left no traces. Perhaps methods were simpler or more complex. The absence of direct evidence means that our understanding remains open, provisional. Yet even this openness is meaningful. It reminds us that knowledge is not always complete, and that mystery is part of the story. What we do see clearly is the persistence of effort. To move such stones required not just tools, but planning, cooperation, and the willingness to invest time far beyond immediate needs. This patience is itself a kind of technology. It is not about speed, but about continuity. The language of effort is written in the stones themselves, in their size, in their placement, in their survival, across centuries. And so, when we look at these great blocks resting in their places, we can sense the quiet determination that carried them. They are not just stones, but memories of movement, frozen journeys from quarry to temple. Each one whispers of hands pulling ropes, of feet pressing against the ground, of voices guiding the rhythm of work. The blocks arrived, one after another, until whole chambers took shape. We pause here, with the picture of slow, deliberate transport, the weight of stone balanced by the patience of people, before we move gently onward. What if we imagine the hands of the builders pausing for a moment, no longer dragging heavy blocks, but leaning closer to carve delicate shapes into the stone? Among the massive walls and rounded chambers of Malta's temples, there are smaller details, patterns etched into surfaces, spirals and curves that seem to echo natural rhythms. These carvings are not many, but they are persistent, and they speak a language beyond structure, a language of symbols. The spiral is one of the most common. It is simple to draw, yet endlessly unfolding. To carve a spiral into stone is to suggest movement without motion, to capture flow within stillness. We cannot know with certainty what these spirals meant to the builders. Perhaps they were reflections of natural cycles, sun and moon, seasons, the turning of life and death. Perhaps they were only decoration, pleasing to the eye, like the doodles we sometimes leave on paper. Both are possible, and absence of proof does not permit us to decide too firmly. What remains is their presence, enduring across thousands of years. Now we pause for a moment on how these symbols are preserved. The limestone of Malta is soft, and carvings upon it can fade with time. Yet many remain visible, protected within the walls of temples, sheltered from direct weathering. Archaeologists record them carefully, tracing lines and photographing surfaces so that even as the stone slowly wears, the patterns are remembered. In this way, the carvings form an archive within an archive, a second layer of memory inside the architecture itself. Other motifs appear as well. Rows of dots, sometimes in patterns like nets or grids. Shapes that resemble leaves or waves. None are detailed enough to give us a clear picture, yet all suggest attention to meaning beyond utility. A wall could have stood plain, but instead it was given a voice. This act of carving, of making marks, may be as important as the meanings themselves. It shows us that the builders cared for symbols, that their world was not only practical, but also expressive. Now we should remain careful. We cannot translate these carvings as if they were words in a known language. We cannot be sure if one spiral meant the same as another, or if different groups understood them differently. What we can do is observe the context. Spirals are often placed near doorways, thresholds between spaces. Perhaps they marked transitions, the crossing from one room to another, from outside to inside. Or perhaps their placement was coincidental. The uncertainty itself is part of the story. The language of traces continues in the small statues found nearby. Rounded figures with broad forms, sometimes seated, sometimes reclining. Some call them mother figures. Others prefer more neutral terms, such as representations of humanity or fertility. We must tread gently here. To assign them a single role is to step beyond the evidence. What we can say is that these figures, like the spirals, show that people gave form to ideas. They shaped symbols from stone and clay, carried them into their temples, and left them as quiet companions. Let us attempt a simple thought experiment. Step 1. Imagine a community gathering to mark a season, perhaps the harvest or the solstice. Inside the temple, light falls on a carved spiral, its curves glowing briefly. Step 2. A small statue is placed near an altar, perhaps as an offering, perhaps as a reminder. People stand together, their attention guided by these symbols, even if each person feels something slightly different. Step 3. After the gathering ends, the spiral remains on the wall. The statue stays in its place. Generations later, others will see them again, layering new meanings on old forms. Through such steps, symbols live longer than their makers. We can now rest with the thought that these carvings and figures are fragments of an inner world, glimpses of beliefs and feelings we cannot fully enter. They remind us that architecture is not only about weight and balance, but also about meaning and imagination. Even in the absence of written language, the builders found ways to leave signs, to inscribe their presence into stone. And so, the spirals and symbols of Malta are not final answers, but open invitations to reflect. They speak softly across millennia, not telling us what to think, but reminding us that people long ago also sought to express cycles, transitions, and mysteries. We pause here with the gentle awareness that symbols endure, not because we fully understand them, but because they continue to invite us to wonder. What if we let ourselves imagine the builders of Malta, not only as people of stone and tools, but also as observers of light and sky? Many of the temples are not arranged at random. Their entrances and passages often align with the rising of the sun, with the turning points of the year that we call solstices and equinoxes. To align a doorway with the sun means to notice patterns across many seasons, to remember, and to set stone in harmony with something larger than daily life. This awareness did not require advanced instruments. It required only patient watching. When the sun rose from the same point on the horizon, at a special moment of the year, people could mark that place with stone and return to it again. Over time, alignments were built into the very structure of temples. The context is vast. Across the world, ancient communities looked to the sky to guide their rhythms. Farming depended on seasons, navigation on stars, rituals on cycles of light and darkness. Malta, small in land but open to the sky and sea, shared in this wider pattern. The people did not write calendars, but their buildings became calendars of stone. At Manajdra, for example, sunlight enters the temple in a particular way during the spring and autumn equinoxes, striking specific slabs. Such alignments may not have been exact by modern standards, but their intention is clear: to weave cosmic cycles into human spaces. Now we must pause to acknowledge what we do not know. Were these alignments intentional or coincidental? The evidence leans toward intention, yet certainty is beyond us. The builders left no written record to confirm their plans. The alignments may have been part of ritual, or they may have served practical use, marking times for planting and harvest. Or they may have carried meanings we cannot imagine. Absence of explanation does not erase the patterns, but it does remind us to move carefully in our interpretations. The language of traces here is one of light and shadow. At certain times of year, beams of sunlight penetrate chambers, touching carved surfaces. At other times, the same chambers remain in shadow. The temples thus record cycles not with ink, but with the movement of light. Archaeologists have observed these moments, filming how the sun enters, how shadows shift across spirals and slabs. The stone becomes a stage for the sky, replaying the same performance every year. Now let us try a small thought experiment. Step 1. Imagine a group gathering at dawn on the day of the solstice. They wait in silence as the horizon begins to glow. Step 2. The sun rises, and light travels into the temple, striking a chosen wall or altar. Gasps may rise, or chants may begin, as the light confirms the turning of the year. Step 3. After the brief moment passes, the chamber falls again into shadow, but memory remains. The people know the cycle will return, steady as the sea, steady as breath. We will never know the exact feelings of those who witnessed such moments. Did they see them as proof of cosmic order, as messages from the sky, as signs from ancestors? We can only sense that they mattered, for the effort of alignment was repeated in more than one temple, across generations. The link between architecture and sky was not casual. It was part of the fabric of life. A quiet point to note is how these alignments also shaped the experience of space. Walking into a temple at the right time of year was not only about seeing light, it was about being part of an event, a rhythm that joined stone, sky, and community. The building became a vessel for time itself, catching cycles and holding them within walls. This idea of time embodied in place is subtle, yet powerful. It shows us that the temples were not only shelters, but instruments, tools for measuring, for remembering, for connecting human life with the larger patterns of the world. And so, we can pause here, with the thought of sunlight entering stone, of horizons remembered in walls, of cycles made visible in shadow and brightness. Whether for ritual or for farming, whether symbolic or practical, the alignments remain as quiet evidence of care and attention. The builders of Malta looked not only to the ground beneath them, but also to the sky above, weaving both into structures that endure. We rest with this gentle image of temples as calendars of stone, before moving softly onward. What if we imagine life unfolding around the temples, not in the silence we meet today, but in the steady rhythm of a small farming community thousands of years ago? The temples were never isolated monuments, standing apart from daily life. They were surrounded by villages, by fields of barley and wheat, by the bleating of goats and the quiet steps of children. To understand the temples, we must also rest with the lives that circled around them, because they were part of one whole. The context of these communities was modest. Malta offered little soil, but enough to sustain families who knew how to tend it with care. Small plots were worked with wooden tools, perhaps stone blades attached, turning earth by hand. Goats and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. Pigs, smaller and easier to keep, gave additional food. Chickpeas and lentils, grains and beans, added variety. Nothing was abundant, but life was possible, balanced between scarcity and sufficiency. Evidence for this comes from layers of soil and ash where animal bones and plant remains are preserved. Archaeologists, sorting through fragments, identify what was eaten, what was grown, what was left behind. In this way, meals of long ago become quiet records in the earth. Charred seeds, small and blackened, whisper of ancient harvests. Goat bones with cut marks remind us of feasts shared near temple walls. Even broken pottery, once used to cook or store, tells us of households that lived in the shadow of stone. Now we pause on what remains uncertain. We cannot know the precise size of these villages. We cannot know how many people gathered in one place at a time. Some estimates suggest hundreds, perhaps more, but such numbers are fragile. They rest on fragments, on cautious comparisons with other sites. What we can say is that life around the temples was communal, centered not only on survival, but on shared spaces where work and ritual met. The language of traces here is vivid, yet incomplete. Post holes in the ground hint at wooden huts, long vanished. Hearths, marked by circles of ash, reveal where fires once burned. Stone tools, worn smooth by grinding grain, remind us of countless hours spent preparing food. These are indirect signs, quiet markers of ordinary existence. They show us that the temples were not distant, but embedded in daily rhythm, in the footsteps between home and field, between work and gathering. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. Imagine dawn, with smoke rising from small fires, grain being ground on stone, animals being let out to graze. The temple stands nearby, not as a separate place, but as part of the morning view. Step 2. In the heat of the day, families work fields, children carry water, voices drift in the air. The temple waits in stillness, its chambers cool and shadowed. Step 3. As evening falls, people gather, perhaps bringing offerings, perhaps sharing meals, blending the practical with the sacred. In this way, the temple is both background and participant, a structure that watches over cycles of life. We must also note the social meaning of proximity. To live near a temple may have reinforced a sense of belonging, of shared identity. The structure itself, massive and enduring, could serve as anchor, a reminder of continuity. Even if its rituals remain unclear to us, its presence surely shaped how communities saw themselves. At the same time, we cannot assume too much. Perhaps the temple was used only occasionally, for specific moments. Perhaps it stood empty for much of the year, visited only on certain days. The evidence does not tell us how often, or by how many, the chambers were entered. We are left with possibilities, open and unfinished. What is certain is that the villages and the temples existed together, influencing one another. The temples needed communities to build and maintain them. The communities, in turn, lived in the shadow of these structures, drawing meaning and order from them. This relationship between daily life and monumentality is part of the larger story of Malta. And so we rest for a moment with this image. Fields tilled, animals tended, meals shared, children playing, and stone temples rising nearby. Not separate worlds, but one woven fabric where survival and ceremony met. The stones endure, but the people who lived among them are gone. Their voices vanished, their gestures forgotten. Only traces remain, faint yet persistent, reminding us that behind every monument was a living community. We pause here, holding this quiet picture of life around the temples, before we move gently further. What if we close our eyes for a moment and imagine not only how the temples looked, but how they sounded? The stones, though silent to us now, once shaped the voices and chants of those who gathered inside. In some chambers, sound behaves in unusual ways. A simple word becomes deeper, stretched as if the stone itself were answering. A low tone, like a hum, lingers longer than expected, filling the room. This effect is not accidental. It is a result of the rounded walls, the narrow passages, and the way air moves inside enclosed spaces. The context here is subtle. Sound, or acoustics, depends on shape and surface. In a modern room, we notice echoes when walls are bare or ceilings high. In Malta's temples, the curved walls and stone slabs create their own patterns of resonance. Certain frequencies, especially low voices, are amplified. This means that when someone spoke or chanted inside, their sound was carried farther, vibrating through the space in ways that may have felt powerful, even otherworldly. Now let us pause on what we do not know. We cannot say with certainty how the builders understood these effects. Did they design temples with sound in mind, or did the acoustics emerge as a byproduct of their chosen forms? The evidence cannot answer fully. Yet modern studies show that resonance is real, measurable, even today. Some chambers respond most strongly to sounds in the range of the human male voice, around 70 to 130 hertz. This is not proof of intention, but it is a suggestive alignment between architecture and experience. The language of traces here is not only visual, but auditory. When archaeologists and researchers tested the temples with sound, they recorded how certain chambers responded. They found that some tones set the air vibrating, creating sensations of immersion. To those inside, this may have felt like a presence larger than themselves, the room itself participating in the voice. Even if the builders did not plan it precisely, they would have noticed it. A chant that grows stronger, a hum that continues after breath has ended. These are effects one cannot ignore. Now we can try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A group gathers in the main chamber. Someone begins a low chant, the sound wrapping around the curves of stone. Step 2. The group joins in, voices blending, filling the space until the distinction between individual voices fades. Step 3. Silence returns, but ears still ring with vibration, as if the stone itself were breathing with them. Such an experience could have carried meaning beyond words, reinforcing ritual, binding community, deepening a sense of connection to place. But we must remain cautious. We cannot say exactly what was sung, or why. We cannot know if sound was central or only incidental. The absence of direct evidence leaves space for humility. What we can hold is the fact of resonance itself, the measurable response of ancient chambers to human sound. It is a trace, as real as a carved spiral or a worn threshold. Now, before we move on, let us linger on the idea of sound as invisible architecture. The temples were built from stone, but they also shaped air. The walls did not only enclose space, they sculpted how sound moved through it. This dual architecture of matter and of vibration may be one reason why these spaces endured as centers of meaning. They engaged more than the eye. They engaged the body, the ear, the feeling of resonance in the chest. And so we rest with this quiet recognition that the temples of Malta, even in their silence today, still carry the memory of voices, chants, and echoes. They remind us that the past is not only something we see, but something we might almost hear if we listen closely. We pause here with the thought of sound lingering in stone before moving softly onward. What if we picture the quiet hands of ancient people shaping not only walls and chambers, but also smaller figures, carved and molded with patience? In Malta's temples, archaeologists have found human-like forms, statues and figurines that seem soft, rounded, and grounded. Some sit, some lie, some stand. Their shapes are often heavy, with wide hips, broad bodies, and calm, almost expressionless faces. To us they may appear familiar, yet distant, like echoes of a language we cannot translate. The context of these figures is deep and layered. They were found not in one place, but in several temples across Malta, suggesting that they were part of a shared tradition. Some are small, fitting in the palm of a hand. Others are larger, heavy enough to rest in one place. Their forms are often abstract, simplified rather than detailed. Instead of fine features, we see general outlines, the curve of a body, the suggestion of limbs, the weight of presence. This simplicity may have been intentional, focusing not on individuals, but on ideas. We should pause here to note what we do not know. Were these figures gods? Were they ancestors? Were they symbols of fertility, or of community, or simply images of people? The evidence does not answer directly. Some researchers once called them fat ladies, seeing in their rounded bodies a link to abundance and fertility. Others urge caution, reminding us that we project our own assumptions. The figures may have carried many meanings, or different meanings at different times. Absence of certainty requires humility. The language of traces helps us look more closely. The figures are usually found near altars or within temple chambers, suggesting that they were part of ritual life, where on their surfaces may show that they were touched or carried, passed through hands before being placed again. Fragments, broken pieces, suggest that they were not always preserved carefully, but sometimes discarded or repurposed. This tells us that they were objects of use, not distant icons on display. They lived in the rhythm of ceremony and daily practice. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A small figure is shaped from clay or carved from stone, its form rounded, its features simple. It is carried into the temple, perhaps as a gift, perhaps as a focus for attention. Step 2. During gatherings, the figure rests near an altar. Hands touch it, voices chant, smoke from offerings drifts around it. Step 3. After years, it breaks, or is set aside. Another is made, repeating the cycle. In this way, the figures become part of continuity, threads connecting generations. Their persistence across centuries suggests they carried meaning deeper than any one ritual. Now we pause for a moment on what they might have meant in a broader sense. Rounded bodies may symbolize life, nourishment, continuity, or they may have represented real people, remembered in symbolic form. The lack of faces, or the vagueness of faces, could suggest universality. Not one person, but every person, or the idea of humanity itself. The truth remains open, but the endurance of the practice suggests that these forms touched something essential in the community. We also note the contrast between the massive temples and the small figures. The temples are immovable, anchored in stone. The figures are portable, intimate, touched by hands. Together, they reflect two scales of human experience: the collective and the personal, the monumental and the fragile. Both are needed to understand the life of Malta's builders. The figures remind us that while stone architecture speaks of permanence, small carved forms speak of the everyday, of moments of touch, of closeness. And so, we rest with the image of these calm, rounded figures, sitting silently in chambers of stone. They may never reveal their full meaning to us, but they remind us of presence, of care, of the human desire to give form to ideas beyond words. We pause here, holding them gently in our imagination before moving softly onward. What if we allow ourselves to linger for a while on the thought that the rounded statues and figures from Malta may have represented not just people, but something larger, something that held communities together in belief and imagination. Some scholars have suggested that these forms could be linked to a goddess, a symbol of fertility, of the earth, of continuity. The figures are often heavy-bodied, with wide hips and resting postures, forms that naturally suggest life-giving qualities. Yet we must tread carefully, because interpretation can shift, and absence of written records means we are moving through mist. The context for this idea is rooted in patterns seen across many ancient cultures. In parts of Europe and the Near East, small figurines with similar rounded bodies have been discovered, often dated to earlier times. These are sometimes connected with fertility, the cycles of birth and harvest, the human desire to ensure continuity. It is tempting to see Malta's figures as part of this same long thread, but we cannot be certain. The resemblance is visual, not necessarily cultural. The people of Malta may have had their own meanings, their own reasons for shaping stone in this way. Now we pause briefly on what we do not know. We cannot say whether these figures were gods, in the sense we use the word today. We cannot know if they were worshipped or if they served more as reminders of abundance and protection. Some statues are large, placed firmly in temple spaces. Others are small, perhaps meant to be held, to be moved, to be personal. This variety complicates any single explanation. What we can see clearly is that these forms mattered. They were made again and again, placed with care, sometimes broken, sometimes buried. The language of traces speaks here through their repetition. When a pattern continues across centuries, it suggests value, even if the precise meaning is lost. The figurines are not isolated finds, but part of a broader context of ritual spaces, altars, offerings, and carved spirals. Together they form a vocabulary of symbols, fragments of a worldview we cannot fully translate. Let us imagine a thought experiment. Step 1. A community gathers inside a temple. At the center rests a large seated figure, carved in stone. People bring offerings, food, small objects, perhaps flowers or grain. Step 2. Someone touches the statue, placing a hand on its rounded form, feeling its cool surface. The figure does not speak, but its presence anchors the gathering, holding attention. Step 3. After the ritual ends, the figure remains, silent and unmoving, while people return to daily life. Generations later, the same figure still sits, its meaning evolving, yet its form constant. Such a cycle shows how objects can carry continuity across time, even as interpretations shift. We must remember, though, that these reconstructions are tentative. What feels like a goddess to us may have been something entirely different to them. The wide forms could symbolize health or community, or simply reflect an aesthetic of abundance. The lack of clear facial features suggests universality, rather than individuality. They may not have been deities at all, but shared icons of collective memory. The absence of certainty is itself meaningful. It keeps us from closing the story too tightly. The figures remain open, inviting reflection rather than giving answers. Their calm, heavy presence mirrors the stone of the temples, enduring, silent, suggestive. We now pause on a softer point. Even if we cannot name their role, we can still sense their effect. To walk into a chamber and see a figure seated, rounded, larger than life, would have shaped the atmosphere. It would have given weight to the space, a center of gravity for ritual and memory. The figures are part of how the temple spoke, not with words, but with forms that shaped emotion and attention. And so we rest with this thought, that Malta's statues may have embodied ideas of fertility, of continuity, of something larger than the individual, perhaps goddess, perhaps ancestor, perhaps symbol of life itself. We do not know. But their persistence across time reminds us that they mattered deeply. We leave the question open, gentle in its uncertainty, before we move quietly onward. What if we imagine the temples not only as structures of stone, but also as places of action, where people gathered to mark moments, to give offerings, to turn ordinary time into something set apart? The walls themselves suggest this. Many chambers contain altars, stone slabs raised slightly above the floor, their surfaces smooth from use. Around them, archaeologists have found animal bones, ashes, fragments of tools. These are not random remains. They hint at meals that carried meaning, at rituals where food was more than sustenance. The context for such practices is familiar if we think carefully. In many ancient societies, offerings were a way of maintaining balance, of showing respect, of connecting the human world with the wider cycles of nature. To place food, or burn bone, or spill liquid on stone, was to acknowledge that life depended on forces larger than the community itself. We cannot know the exact words spoken in these temples, but the traces suggest that they were places where people gave as well as received. Now we should pause to notice what we do not know. We cannot say with certainty whether the offerings were directed to deities, to ancestors, or to the cycles of the sun and earth. We cannot be sure if they were collective feasts or if only a few took part. What we hold are fragments, charred remains, butchered bones, soot stains on stone. These are small signals, indirect and partial. Yet they are steady enough to tell us that rituals of giving were woven into the life of the temples. The language of traces speaks quietly but clearly. In some temples, piles of animal bones suggest repeated gatherings. In others, burnt layers of ash show where fires were lit again and again. On altars, grooves worn into stone may mark the cutting or placing of objects. Pottery shards found nearby, broken and discarded, remind us that food and drink accompanied these moments. The evidence may be incomplete, but together it creates a picture of ritualized meals and offerings. Let us try a thought experiment. Step 1. A community gathers, bringing with them animals, grain, and prepared food. They move into the temple chambers, where light and shadow create an atmosphere apart from the open world. Step 2. A goat is offered, its bones later burned on a stone altar. Food is shared, but some is left aside, given back to the place itself. Voices murmur, chants rise, smoke drifts into the air. Step 3. The remains are cleared, fragments left behind. Over years, these fragments build into layers, which archaeologists uncover millennia later. Each layer a thin record of repetition. We must remain cautious not to imagine too vividly. Perhaps not every bone was part of ritual. Perhaps some meals were simply practical, taken near the temple for convenience. The line between the sacred and the ordinary may not have been as sharp as we imagine. The temples may have been places where life and ritual blended, where offerings were part of larger gatherings, feasts that were both practical and symbolic. Yet even with these uncertainties, the persistence of altars and the repeated presence of burnt remains suggest that something deliberate was taking place, something that mattered deeply to those who built and used these spaces. Now we will pause on a softer point. Rituals, whatever their details, are less about fixed rules and more about rhythm. They create continuity. The repeated act of offering, year after year, generation after generation, tied people to their past and to each other. The altars of Malta's temples may have been such anchors, steady points around which life revolved. We will never know the exact prayers spoken or the gestures made. But the stones, the bones, and the ashes tell us that offerings were real, repeated, and enduring. And so we rest with this thought. The temples were not empty monuments, but living spaces of ritual, where food, fire, and stone came together. What was given there may have been meant for gods, for ancestors, or for the cycle of the earth itself. We cannot know for sure, but we can sense that giving, in all its forms, was central to the meaning of these places. We hold this awareness gently, letting it settle, before moving softly onward. What if we allow ourselves to picture the temples not only as spaces of ritual, but also as places where the living carried their thoughts about the dead? In Malta, traces suggest that the temples and related underground chambers may have been connected with practices of burial, remembrance, and the long cycle of life and death. To walk into such a space would not have been only to enter stone. It may also have been to step into the memory of ancestors. The context here lies in what archaeologists call collective burials. Unlike later traditions of individual graves with names and markers, these ancient communities often placed many people together in shared chambers. The remains are usually fragmentary, sometimes burned, sometimes rearranged. This suggests that the dead were not left untouched, but part of a continuing process of care. Bones were gathered, moved, perhaps displayed, then finally placed in chambers carved deep into rock. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, an underground complex, is one of the clearest examples. Within its chambers, thousands of human bones were found, layered over centuries. The rooms are carved in the same rounded forms as the above-ground temples, echoing the same architecture in shadowed silence. This continuity of form suggests a connection between the places of the living and the places of the dead. Now we pause for a moment to reflect on what we do know. Were the temples themselves used for burials, or only for ceremonies linked to death? Were the underground spaces reserved for this purpose, while the temples above served other roles? The evidence is not uniform. In some places, bones are present. In others, none have been found. The absence of remains does not mean absence of ritual. Perhaps bodies were placed elsewhere, or perhaps organic traces have not survived. We must remain cautious, open to multiple possibilities. The language of traces here is written in bone and soil. Layers of human remains, mixed with animal bones and pottery, show that the dead were not isolated from the rhythms of life. Pollen grains in sediments suggest that plants, perhaps flowers or herbs, were placed with bodies. Red ochre, a natural pigment, is sometimes found, hinting at the coloring of bones or walls. These fragments, though incomplete, point to practices that treated death not as an end, but as a passage woven into ritual cycles. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A member of the community dies. The body is prepared, perhaps painted with ochre, perhaps wrapped in cloth. Step 2. It is placed in a chamber, alongside others who came before, in silence lit by oil lamps. Family members touch bones, whisper names, or leave offerings. Step 3. As time passes, the remains become part of a larger collection. Generations gather again, adding new bones, moving old ones, keeping the memory of the dead within reach of the living. This cycle, repeated across centuries, creates a continuity that is felt more than written. We cannot know the exact beliefs that guided this. Did they imagine an afterlife? Or did they see death as a return to earth, a merging with ancestors? The stones do not tell us, but the persistence of collective burial suggests that memory and community were central. The dead were not forgotten individuals, but part of an ongoing whole. Now we pause to notice a quiet connection. The rounded chambers of the hypogeum echo the rounded forms of the temples. Above ground, rituals of offering, sound, and light. Below ground, rituals of burial, silence, and shadow. Together, they form two halves of a world, one for the living, one for the dead, both bound by the same architecture of curves and stone. This symmetry may have carried meaning. Perhaps life and death were seen as parts of the same circle, as inseparable as day and night. And so we rest with this image: temples of light above, chambers of shadow below, both shaping how people thought about their place in time. The traces left behind, bones, pigments, fragments of pottery, are quiet reminders of how carefully these people held their dead within the cycles of life. We cannot know their prayers, but we can sense their patience, their care, and their desire for continuity. We pause here, gently aware of this balance, before moving softly onward. What if we think of the temples not only as stone and ritual, but also as mirrors of how people organize themselves as communities? To raise walls of this size, to move stones of such weight, required more than tools. It required cooperation, planning, and shared belief. The temples stand as traces not only of architecture, but of social life, of how people worked together and found meaning in collective effort. The context here is that Malta, during the Temple period, held only small populations. Estimates suggest a few thousand people across the islands. Yet even with such modest numbers, they created some of the largest freestanding stone monuments in the world. This tells us something important. The building of temples was not the work of a few, but of many hands. Families and villages must have coordinated, giving time and energy to projects that went beyond immediate survival. This hints at social structures, perhaps leaders, perhaps councils, though we cannot say what form they took. Now we pause for a moment to notice what we do not know. No written records remain. No names of leaders. No rules inscribed in stone. We cannot speak of kings or priests with confidence. The temples do not show signs of palaces or houses of the elite nearby. This absence suggests that if hierarchy existed, it may have been subtle, shared through influence and ritual rather than force or wealth. It may also mean that leadership was temporary, tied to seasons or ceremonies. The evidence does not fix a clear answer. The language of traces, however, offers quiet clues. The scale of construction shows organization beyond the household. The repetition of similar architectural forms across the islands suggests communication and shared traditions. The presence of altars and symbolic carvings implies roles for certain individuals, perhaps as guides of ritual or keepers of memory. Yet these roles may have been fluid, changing with generations, not fixed in the way later priesthoods or monarchies became. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A group gathers to begin work on a new temple. Some bring stone tools, others bring food, others prepare ropes and rollers. Step 2. Work begins. Stronger members cut stone, while others drag, while still others watch children or prepare meals. Leadership emerges naturally, with experienced builders guiding tasks. Step 3. As the structure rises, rituals mark each stage. The act of building becomes both labor and ceremony, binding the community together. In this way, the temple is not just the product of society, but also its teacher, shaping cooperation through shared action. We must remain careful. To imagine too much detail risks stepping beyond evidence. Perhaps some communities were more hierarchical than others. Perhaps disputes arose. Perhaps some resisted the effort. The silence of archaeology does not reveal conflict. Yet the persistence of temple building across centuries suggests that cooperation, whatever its form, was sustained. This continuity itself is remarkable. Now we may pause on another gentle point. The temples, though monumental, were not fortresses. They lack walls for defense, weapons, or signs of battle. This absence may tell us that their communities were not organized around war or dominance, but around cycles of life, ritual, and cooperation. Again, absence is not proof, but it is a quiet reminder that not all human effort has been shaped by conflict. Some societies chose other paths, and so we rest with this thought. The temples are silent records of social life, of people who lived not in large cities, not under kings, but in small communities that still found ways to create enduring monuments. Their organization was real, their cooperation steady, their structures lasting. We cannot know the exact form of their leadership or the details of their society, but we can sense the balance between effort and meaning, between the practical and the symbolic. We pause here, holding this awareness gently, before moving softly onward. What if we pause to imagine not only the stones and carvings of the temples, but also the small and fragile objects that once filled them? Around the chambers, beneath the floors, and within the soil layers, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of pottery, beads, shells, and tools. These items, though modest compared to great blocks of limestone, are like whispers, carrying delicate traces of the daily and the ceremonial. They tell us that the temples were not empty shells, but living places, furnished with objects that had meaning in both practical and symbolic ways. The context is broad. In the prehistoric world, pottery was not only a container, but a canvas. People shaped clay by hand, smoothed it, and sometimes decorated it with lines or dots before firing. In Malta, many of these vessels were simple, used for cooking, storing grain, or holding water. But some, found within temples, were different, placed carefully, sometimes broken deliberately, sometimes buried with ashes or offerings. The line between ordinary and sacred objects was not always sharp. A pot that held food in daily life could also hold offerings in ritual. Now we pause for a moment to notice what we do not know. Were these objects owned by individuals or by the community? Were beads worn every day or only in ceremonies? Were shells gathered for their beauty or for symbolic reasons? The evidence does not speak directly. We see only what survived, and survival is selective. Clay endures, while wood and cloth do not. Bones remain, but leather decays. What we hold is partial, like fragments of a song. The language of traces speaks through patterns. In some temples, small piles of pottery shards are found together, suggesting intentional placement. In others, beads made of stone or shell appear near altars, perhaps once part of necklaces or garments. Animal bones mixed with pottery hint at feasting, with broken vessels marking the conclusion of shared meals. Even the absence of certain materials, no gold, no bronze, tells us something. It suggests a world where value lay not in rare metals, but in the care of shaping everyday materials into meaningful forms. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A woman strings beads of shell onto a cord, wearing them during a gathering. The shells, smooth and white, catch the light in the temple chamber. Step 2. After the gathering, the necklace is placed near an altar, not to be worn again. Its presence there becomes part of the memory of the event. Step 3. Centuries later, the cord has decayed, but the beads remain, buried in soil. When uncovered, they no longer tell us the words spoken, but they remind us that beauty and meaning were woven into ritual. We must remain cautious. It is easy to imagine symbolism where there may have been none. A broken pot may simply be a broken pot. A shell may have been collected for play rather than ceremony. But when we see repetition, many vessels near altars, many beads in ritual spaces, it suggests patterns beyond chance. The consistency of these finds across sites gives weight to the idea that objects played roles in the life of the temples. Now we can pause briefly on another layer of meaning. Small objects are portable, intimate. Unlike the massive stones, they could be touched, carried, worn close to the body. They connect the monumental scale of the temples with the personal scale of individuals. To hold a bead or cup is to feel the link between human hand and enduring object. The temples, vast and still, were filled with these smaller gestures, weaving together the scales of life. And so, we rest with this picture. The great stone chambers holding not only echoes of voices, but also small offerings, beads, pottery, shells. Fragile traces that survived across thousands of years, reminding us that even in places of monumentality, the personal and the delicate were present. We cannot know the exact meanings, but we can sense the care, the repetition, the human need to leave tokens in spaces that mattered. We pause here, gently holding this thought, before moving softly onward. What if we think of the temples not only as silent ruins of stone, but as places once alive with rhythm, where movement itself may have been part of the ritual? When we walk through the narrow entrances into chambers that open like petals, we can almost sense how the space might have guided people. The design seems to invite processions, slow movement from light into shadow, from outer court to inner room. The architecture shapes not only what is seen, but how one moves, how one feels the passage of steps. The context of procession is familiar across many ancient cultures. Movement itself was ritual, not only the act of arrival. To walk together, to pause at thresholds, to turn into a chamber, was to participate in a performance that carried meaning. In Malta's temples, the curved walls, the aligned doorways, and the sequence of chambers suggest a choreography, even if we cannot reconstruct it fully. The builders may have understood that space directs the body, and that movement can deepen the sense of transition. Now we pause briefly on what we do not know. We cannot say who walked these paths, or how many. Were these rituals for all, or for a chosen few? Were they solemn or celebratory? We do not have songs or instructions written down. We can only infer from the layout, from the wear of thresholds, from the arrangement of chambers. The traces are indirect, but they are steady enough to suggest that ritual involved not just stillness, but movement. The language of traces here lies in architecture itself. The narrow doorways that lead into larger chambers suggest controlled entry, perhaps one by one, perhaps in sequence. The polished floors, worn smoother in certain places, hint at repeated footsteps. Alignments with sunlight may have guided when movement took place, the rising or setting sun turning the procession into a cosmic rhythm. Even carvings, spirals placed near entrances, may have marked points of transition, places where people paused or shifted from one stage to another. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A group gathers outside, the air filled with quiet anticipation. The sun begins to rise and light strikes the entrance. Step 2. They move inward, slowly, one after another, through a narrow passage. Shadows deepen, voices hush. Step 3. They enter the inner chamber, where light falls softly, perhaps on an altar or a figure. The act of walking, of passing, becomes itself the heart of the ritual. Such a reconstruction is tentative, but it helps us imagine how movement and space may have been intertwined. Now we should rest for a moment on the thought of sound and movement together. If voices echoed in these spaces, if drums or simple rhythms accompanied processions, the experience would have been immersive. The temple would not only enclose space, it would shape time, guiding participants through a sequence of moments. The ritual would have been not a single act, but a journey. Still, we must remain cautious. We do not know if processions were frequent or rare, if they marked seasonal cycles or personal transitions. The evidence is incomplete. The silence of the stones leaves gaps. But the consistency of temple layouts, the repetition of curved chambers and aligned passages, suggests that movement was part of the design, and design is rarely without purpose. And so, we pause here with the image of people moving slowly through stone corridors, their footsteps blending with light and shadow. The temples become not only buildings, but pathways, spaces meant to be experienced in motion as well as stillness. We cannot claim to know the exact choreography, but we can feel the invitation of the space itself. We hold this picture gently, letting it settle like a slow breath before moving softly onward. What if we pause for a moment and think of the temples not only as places of stone and gathering, but also as spaces shaped by fire? Beneath the floors, in corners of chambers, and near altars, archaeologists have found layers of ash, charcoal, and burned bone. Fire leaves its own kind of memory, a memory written in blackened traces and in the chemistry of soil. These faint signs suggest that fire was not just a tool for cooking, but also part of ritual, woven into the rhythms of offering and remembrance. The context for fire in ancient life was wide. It was central to warmth, to food, to light. But in ritual, fire had an added quality. It transformed. Wood became ash, bone became brittle, offerings disappeared into smoke. Fire turned the material into the immaterial, carrying what was given into the air. In this way, fire may have served as a bridge between visible life and invisible meaning. In the temples of Malta, the traces of burning suggest that this process was important, though we cannot know exactly how it was understood. Now we pause to acknowledge what we do not know. Were these fires large or small? Were they lit often or only at rare moments? Were they for sacrifice, for feasting, or for symbolic cleansing? The remains do not tell us directly. Charcoal can be dated, bones can be identified, but the reasons are hidden. What we can say is that fire was present, and present in ways that left repeating marks in sacred spaces. The language of traces here is strong. Layers of ash build up slowly, each one the residue of a burning long past. Charred animal bones suggest food, perhaps consumed, perhaps offered. Burned stone surfaces reveal that flames were sometimes strong enough to alter the very fabric of the temple. Even soil chemistry holds memories. The presence of certain minerals signals repeated burning. These are not dramatic fires that consume buildings, but steady, deliberate flames, tended with intention. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A group gathers at dusk, placing wood on a small hearth within the chamber. A spark is struck, and smoke curls upward. Step 2. Offerings are placed in the fire. Meat, grain, perhaps even small vessels. Flames flicker, shadows move across the walls, and voices rise with the smoke. Step 3. When the fire dies down, ashes remain. Some are left where they fall. Others are gathered, perhaps scattered outside, perhaps stored. Over time, these layers build quietly, creating a record beneath the feet of generations. Still, we must remain cautious. Not every fire was ritual. Some may have been practical, warming a space, lighting a chamber, cooking a meal. The line between sacred and ordinary may not have been sharp. What feels like offering to us may have been part of daily life. Yet the persistence of fire traces within temple walls suggests that flames were more than accidental. They were part of how these spaces were used, part of the rhythm that gave them life. Now we pause on a softer point. Fire is both fleeting and enduring. Its light lasts only moments, but its ashes remain for thousands of years. In this way, it is a perfect symbol of ritual. The act is temporary, the trace is permanent. The builders of Malta may not have thought of it in these terms, but we, looking back, can see how fire connects us across time. A small flame burning in the dark, leaving behind a memory written in soil. And so we rest with this image. Temples filled not only with stone and silence, but with flickering light, with warmth, with smoke rising into shadowed chambers. Fire was part of their life, part of their meaning, part of what endured in trace, if not in memory. We cannot know the exact prayers or the full intention, but we can feel the quiet persistence of flame as part of the story. We pause here, gently aware of the ashes beneath the stones, before moving softly onward. What if we let our thoughts rest on the possibility that sound and fire were not the only forces shaping the temple experience, but that scents and substances also played a role? In quiet corners of the temples, traces of burnt herbs, resins, and animal fat have been discovered, suggesting that smoke carried more than light and warmth. It carried smell. To imagine the temples only in sight and sound is to leave them incomplete. To add scent is to complete the atmosphere, to bring us closer to how they were once experienced by those who entered. The context of ancient ritual often included incense, herbs, and aromatic woods. These were not luxuries, but parts of a sensory language. Just as sound could transform a chamber, scent could shift mood and mark transitions. The burning of herbs like juniper or rosemary, common in the Mediterranean, would have filled the air with fragrance, sharp and cleansing. Animal fat, when burned, gave off a heavy, lingering smell, more somber, perhaps tied to sacrifice. Such combinations may have created a rhythm of senses, sight, sound, smell, binding the community into shared experience. Now we pause for a moment on what we do not know. The evidence for these substances is faint. Ash and soil layers contain microscopic remains, pollen grains, chemical residues that suggest plants and fats were burned. but we cannot say with certainty which plants or in what context. Were they used daily or only for special moments? Were they part of feasting or purely symbolic? The traces are too fragmentary to answer fully. What we can say is that smell, as invisible as it is, leaves its mark in the chemistry of soil, and this chemistry whispers to us across time. The language of traces here is subtle. Residues of carbonized seeds show that herbs were present. Analysis of burnt layers reveals compounds consistent with aromatic plants. Even the soil around altars contains tiny markers that suggest the presence of oils or fats. These are not dramatic findings, but they are steady, and together they suggest that smell was part of the temple's vocabulary. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A fire is lit within the temple, and bundles of herbs are placed upon it. Smoke rises carrying a sharp, fragrant scent. Step 2. The people gathered inhale this smell, which fills the chamber, changing how they feel. It marks the moment as different from daily life. It prepares them for ritual. Step 3. The smoke drifts upward, curling into dark corners, clinging to stone. When the fire dies, the scent lingers, soft but present, tying memory to place. Even centuries later, faint chemical traces remain in the soil, invisible but persistent. We must remain cautious. It is possible that some of these substances were burned not for ritual, but for practical reasons: herbs to repel insects, fats to fuel lamps. The line between the practical and the sacred may not have been firm, but in either case, the effect on those present would have been the same. An atmosphere changed, a space transformed by smell. Now we pause on a softer point. Scents are tied strongly to memory. Even today, a smell can bring back moments long forgotten. Perhaps in the temple, the repetition of the same herbs, the same smoke, the same fire, created a memory that bound generations. A child smelling the burning of rosemary might remember it as an adult, might repeat it as an elder, carrying continuity across time. And so, we rest with this picture. The temples not only echoing with sound and glowing with fire, but also filled with fragrance, with air transformed by smoke. The builders of Malta may not have left us words, but they left us traces of how they engaged every sense. We cannot know the exact recipes or the precise meanings, but we can sense the care, the intention, the layering of sound, sight, and smell into a full experience. We pause here, gently aware of this hidden layer, before moving softly onward. What if we pause to imagine the temples, not only as places where rituals unfolded, but also as spaces where stories were told? Human beings, across all times, have shared knowledge through narrative, through myths, through remembered tales, through spoken words passed from one generation to the next. In Malta's temples, without writing, stories may have been the threads that held communities together, explaining why the temples stood, why the seasons turned, why ancestors mattered. The context of oral tradition is wide. In societies without written language, memory itself becomes an archive. Knowledge is stored in rhythms of speech, in repeated tales, in songs that children learn and elders carry. These are fragile archives, yet they can endure for centuries, reshaped slightly each time, but carrying the same core. The temples, with their spirals carved in stone and their chambers arranged like unfolding paths, may have served as settings for such storytelling. They gave the stories weight, a place to echo, a frame of permanence around fleeting words. Now we must pause on what we do not know. No story from Malta's temple period has survived directly. We have no names of gods, no myths carved in stone, no chants inscribed on tablets. The silence is almost complete. But absence of writing is not absence of narrative. It is likely that the builders told stories, because all communities do. The question is not whether, but how, and what themes may have mattered most. The language of traces here is indirect. The spiral carvings suggest ideas of cycles, of continuity. The alignment of temples with sunrises hints at stories tied to the sky, to turning points of light and shadow. The presence of figurines suggests myths of fertility, of life and death, of abundance. None of these are fixed conclusions, but they are signals. They suggest that the stories told in these temples may have drawn on nature, on ancestors, on cycles larger than human life. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A group gathers in the shadowed chamber. A fire burns softly, smoke curling upward. Step 2. An elder begins to speak, telling of the first stone raised, of the first light that entered the temple at dawn. Children listen, adults nod, the story familiar, yet renewed. Step 3. The tale ends, and silence falls. The words vanish into air, but the memory remains, ready to be spoken again in another season. Through this rhythm, knowledge passes forward. The temples, standing still, become stages for stories that move. We must remain cautious. We cannot know the exact content of these tales. They may have been myths of creation, or explanations of rituals, or stories of ancestors. They may have changed with each generation, shaped by new experiences. What matters for us is not the details, but the recognition that stories were likely central to temple life. Without writing, narrative was the thread of continuity. Now we pause for a softer point. Oral tradition is fragile, yet powerful. It disappears if not spoken, yet it can endure if repeated. The temples, built of stone, gave stability to the intangible. They anchored the spoken word in place. When people gathered inside, the combination of sound, scent, light, and story may have created an atmosphere where memory was reinforced. The words themselves are gone, but the structures that hosted them remain. And so, we rest with this image. Temples not only filled with ritual action, but also with stories told in darkness, by firelight, echoing against curved walls. The words are lost, but the need for story endures, across time, across all communities. We cannot recover their exact voices, but we can sense the importance of narrative as part of what made the temples alive. We pause here, gently holding this awareness, before moving softly onward. What if we allow ourselves to think of the temples not just as centers of ritual, but also as markers of time itself? Stone, unlike voice or fire, endures. And in the alignments of doorways, in the placement of chambers, we may sense an ancient attempt to measure the passing of days and seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the length of shadows, the patterns of light. These rhythms may have been woven into the architecture, allowing the community to follow cycles larger than their own lives. The context is simple, but profound. Before calendars, before written records, time was read in the sky. The tilt of the earth brings seasons. The movement of the sun marks solstices and equinoxes. In Malta, the temples appear to interact with these cycles. At certain times of the year, the first light of dawn shines directly through entrances, reaching into inner chambers. These moments are brief, predictable, and rare. They may have been signals: when to plant, when to harvest, when to gather. Such alignments are seen in many ancient cultures. Malta's temples seem to share this language of stone and sky. Now let us pause on what we do not know. Were these alignments intentional, or are we projecting meaning where none was meant? We cannot be certain. The stones are shifted by time, eroded, rebuilt in parts. The precision may not have been exact. Still, the repetition of similar orientations across different sites suggests a pattern. It is unlikely to be pure chance. At the very least, the builders were aware of how the sun entered their spaces, and they allowed that light to become part of the experience. The language of traces here is written in light and shadow. At Mnajdra, one of the southern temples, the spring and autumn equinoxes are marked by dawn sunlight passing through the main doorway, illuminating the central axis. At solstices, the light falls differently, touching specific stones. These observations are modern, made with measuring tools, but they reflect something the builders must also have noticed. To see the first rays enter the heart of a temple at the same moment every year would have been striking, a reminder that human life is part of a larger rhythm. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. Dawn approaches on the day of the equinox. A group gathers outside, waiting in silence. Step 2. As the sun rises, light enters the temple, moving slowly along the floor until it touches a central stone. Step 3. The gathering breathes together, recognizing that the cycle has turned, that day and night are balanced, that another season begins. Such a ritual does not require words. It is an act of watching, of aligning human life with the sky. We should remain cautious. Perhaps not every alignment was perfect. Perhaps the meanings changed over time. The sun may have served not only practical needs, but also symbolic ones, linking the community to the cosmos. Whether for farming, for ritual, or for both, the temples clearly engaged with the heavens. Now we pause to notice a softer point. To watch the sun in this way is also to watch ourselves. The repetition of light across generations ties people to memory, reminding them that they stand where their ancestors once stood, seeing the same dawn. The temples, massive and still, became instruments for marking not only time, but continuity itself. And so, we rest with this thought. Malta's temples were more than stone. They were calendars carved in rock, keeping rhythm with the sky. We cannot know the full intention, but we can sense the care, the patience, the desire to anchor human life in cycles larger than a single lifetime. We hold this image gently, like dawn itself, before moving softly onward. What if we allow ourselves to see the temples, not only as markers of space and ritual, but also as instruments for observing the slow dance of stars and moon across the sky? The sun, with its daily path and yearly rhythm, is easier to trace, but the night sky, filled with countless points of light, also leaves patterns that return with patient regularity. To lift our eyes upward was as natural for them as it is for us. And the great stones may have been arranged not only to frame dawn, but also to anchor memory of what was seen after sunset. The context is wide. Ancient societies across the world often built in relation to the heavens. The stars rise and set in repeating arcs. The moon waxes and wanes. The planets wander slowly against the fixed background. Without clocks or written charts, the sky itself was the calendar, the measure, the story. In Malta, some researchers have suggested that certain alignments of temples may also have pointed toward lunar cycles, or to star groups that held seasonal importance. The evidence is less direct than with the sun, but it invites reflection. Now we must pause gently on what we do not know. The stones are weathered, the lines not perfect. We cannot say with certainty that the builders watched Orion, or the Pleiades, or the bright star Sirius. The alignments may be coincidence, or may have shifted over millennia. Absence of clear proof does not mean absence of intention, but it leaves us cautious. We are left with possibility, not conclusion. The language of traces here is subtle. The orientation of certain passages, the shaping of openings, the placement of altars, all hint that light, whether of sun or moon, mattered. Soil samples even preserve traces of activity at specific times of year, consistent with cycles marked by the heavens. The repetition of temple building with similar orientations suggests that watching the sky was not accidental, but part of a shared way of life. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A community gathers at night, the temple silhouetted against the stars. The air is quiet, only voices and the sound of fire. Step 2. As the moon rises, its light falls along a doorway, marking a moment known from generations past. Children notice, elders nod. Step 3. The group reflects, perhaps weaving story and season, perhaps using the site as signal for planting, or for ritual of renewal. The sky is not just backdrop, but guide, partner, reminder. Still, we must remain cautious. The precision of ancient observation was real, but we cannot claim to know their exact targets. What mattered may not have been the same constellations we name today. Perhaps their focus was more on rhythm than on map, on the return of light rather than the tracing of star groups. We are left with fragments, not the whole picture. Now we pause for a softer point. To watch the sky is to sense both vastness and continuity. The same stars seen by ancestors are seen again by descendants. The temples rooted in earth may have been bridges to that sky, anchoring the infinite to the ground, giving the community a place from which to look upward together. And so, we rest with this thought. The builders of Malta may have lifted their eyes to the night sky, and their temples may have been part of that gesture. The stones do not speak clearly, but they suggest awareness of cycles larger than human life. We cannot say which stars mattered, but we can feel the quiet persistence of attention, the patient watching of sky from earth. We pause here, gently aware of this cosmic connection, before moving softly onward. What if we imagine the temples not only as sanctuaries of ritual and sky, but also as places where healing may have been sought? Across many early societies, sacred spaces carried roles of both spiritual and physical care. Illness was not always seen as separate from the divine. To mend the body, one might also address the unseen. In Malta's temples, we do not find hospitals in the modern sense, yet subtle signs hint that the sick or the troubled could have been brought into these chambers, where ritual, sound, and touch may have been parts of healing. The context is broad. In ancient worlds, remedies were a blend of knowledge and belief. Herbs gathered from the land, simple massage, chants, and ritual offerings were all intertwined. Healing was communal, not individual, a practice carried out in spaces that carried meaning. The hypogeum, with its resonant chambers, suggests the possibility of sound being used to influence mind and body. Archaeologists have noted that certain rooms amplify low tones, creating sensations that can alter perception. Whether by design or by chance, such spaces may have been used in ways that blurred the boundary between ritual and therapy. Now let us pause gently on what we do not know. There is no direct record of doctors or healers in the Maltese temples. No medical texts, no lists of remedies. The evidence is indirect. Bones with signs of healed injuries, figurines that may depict pregnancy or birth, chambers that affect the senses. We cannot say with certainty that healing rituals occurred here, but we can recognize that communities without writing or hospitals still had needs for care, and they often turned to their most meaningful spaces. The language of traces here is scattered but persistent. Skeletal remains show survival of injuries that would have required care, broken bones that healed, conditions that suggest others assisted in survival. Figurines with rounded bellies may reflect concern with fertility, a kind of healing tied to life cycles. In some soil layers, residues of herbs suggest that plants with soothing or aromatic qualities were burned or placed nearby. Together, these traces point toward the possibility of the temples being part of healing life. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. Someone is ill, perhaps fevered, perhaps wounded. They are brought into a chamber where light is dim and air is cool. Step 2. Herbs are burned, their fragrance filling the space. A chant rises, voices resonating with the stone, sound wrapping around the body. Step 3. Hands apply poultices. Words of care are spoken. And in that moment, the act of healing is both physical and symbolic, woven into the rhythm of community. We must remain cautious. Not all evidence leads clearly to healing. What we see may have been symbolic fertility rituals or ceremonies of passage. The idea of healing may overlap with protection, blessing, or remembrance. But the persistence of traces related to body, to fertility, to resonance, suggests that the temples could have served roles beyond pure worship. Now we pause to reflect on a softer point. Healing, in many cultures, is not only about curing disease, but also about creating calm, giving hope, and connecting the ill to something larger than themselves. In this sense, the temples, with their silence and resonance, may have offered comfort as much as remedy. To lie in stone chambers where voices echo gently may have been itself a kind of medicine. And so we rest with this image. Temples not only as places of offering and story, but as quiet sanctuaries where pain was met with care, where sound and scent, ritual and touch came together in attempts to heal. We cannot know the details, but we can sense that in such enduring spaces, care for the body and care for the spirit were not far apart. We pause here, gently aware of this possibility, before moving softly onward. What if we allow ourselves to think of the temples not only as spaces for the living, but also as places where the boundary with the dead was softened, where memory and presence of ancestors were woven into daily ritual? In many cultures, burial grounds and sacred architecture stand side by side, reminding us that communities often kept their dead near, not hidden, but integrated into life. On Malta, the great hypogeum, carved deep into rock, with chambers filled by bones, offers one of the strongest hints that the temple builders held the dead close. The context of ancestor connection is vast. Long before writing, remembrance of those who came before was preserved not through texts, but through proximity. Bones, placed in chambers, became reminders of continuity. In Malta, collective burials show that individuals were not kept apart, but gathered together, generations resting side by side. The temples above ground, with their carvings and altars, and the hypogeum below ground, with its labyrinth of silence, form a dialogue between earth and sky, between the living and the dead. Now we must pause, on what we do not know. We cannot say if these ancestors were worshipped or simply remembered. We cannot say if bones were visited or if rituals were held in their presence. The absence of texts leaves us uncertain. Yet the scale of effort devoted to burial chambers suggests that death was not final separation, but part of the same cycle that the spirals on temple stones seem to echo. The language of traces here is weighty. Bones numbering in the thousands speak of repeated return, of community choosing to place their dead together. Red ochre, traces of pigment found on bones and walls, suggests ritual marking, a symbolic return of life's color, even in death. The architecture itself, carved in curves like those above ground, implies continuity between spaces of the living and spaces of the dead. Even echoes in the hypogeum, resonant at certain tones, suggest that sound may have accompanied ritual remembrance, voices vibrating against stone and bone alike. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A body is prepared, perhaps painted, perhaps wrapped. It is carried into the hypogeum, lit by torches, and placed among many others. Step 2. Chants or sounds echo through the chamber, the voices of the living mingling with the silence of the dead. Step 3. The group departs, leaving the bones behind, but carrying with them the awareness that ancestors remain close, beneath the earth, part of the same world. We must remain cautious. Not all remains may have been placed with ceremony. Some may reflect practical need for burial space. Some chambers may have been reused or reinterpreted across centuries. Yet the persistence of collective burial suggests a vision of community that included both living and dead together. Now we pause for a softer reflection. To live with ancestors nearby is to feel continuity. Each generation walks not as isolated beings, but as part of a longer thread. The temples, with their rituals of light and sound, and the hypogeum, with its chambers of rest, both serve to anchor this sense of belonging across time. And so, we rest with this image. The temples not only as monuments of stone, but as bridges between presence and absence, where ancestors were not forgotten, but enfolded into community life. We cannot know the exact beliefs, but we can sense the quiet reverence for continuity, for memory, for the weaving of life and death into a single fabric. We pause here, gently aware of this closeness, before moving softly onward. What if we pause to consider that the temples, while built of enduring stone, also held within them the fragility of daily life? Rituals may have filled the chambers, but between ceremonies, people likely gathered, shared food, exchanged goods, and wove threads of community. These were not only sacred monuments standing apart, but also centers of life, where the sacred and the ordinary intertwined. In this way, the temples may have served as nodes of exchange, where the rhythms of survival and the rhythms of belief overlapped gently. The context is important. On small islands like Malta, resources were limited and communities tightly bound. To survive required cooperation. Food, tools, and knowledge had to be shared. The temples, large enough to gather many, provided spaces where this cooperation could be made visible. Just as modern marketplaces or town squares combine commerce with social contact, the temples may have been places where offerings and meals were intertwined, where rituals gave meaning to the practical sharing of resources. Now let us pause softly on what we do not know. Archaeology leaves us only fragments. Animal bones, charred seeds, broken pottery. These can suggest feasting, but they do not tell us whether such feasts were sacred, communal, or both. We cannot say if the temples hosted trade, or if exchanges occurred nearby. The silence of the stones does not reveal the full picture. Yet the traces of food, of gathering, of repeated use, suggest that daily life brushed closely against sacred space. The language of traces here is simple, yet telling. Layers of ash mixed with animal bone suggest repeated cooking and eating. Potsherds, fragments of vessels, indicate shared meals, not isolated consumption. Soil analysis reveals seeds of grains and legumes, plants that sustained communities. These small remnants, overlooked in the grandeur of stone, are the quiet markers of daily survival within sacred walls. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A ritual is performed. Offerings are made. Chants echo within the chambers. Step 2. As the ritual ends, food is shared among those gathered. Meat roasted, bread divided, drink poured. The act of eating together becomes part of the same cycle as prayer, binding community in both body and spirit. Step 3. When the meal is done, remnants are left behind, buried in soil, forgotten by those who feasted, but preserved for millennia as traces of their presence. We must remain cautious. What we interpret as feasting could have been ritual deposition, offerings to deities, rather than meals for people. Broken pottery may have been intentionally smashed, part of ceremony rather than accident. The boundary between sacred and everyday is not easy to draw. Yet the presence of food remains suggests that life, in its ordinary form, found space within these temples. Now we pause for a softer reflection. Sacredness does not always exclude daily life. Often it embraces it. To eat together is to affirm belonging. To share resources in a sacred space is to weave survival into meaning. The temples may have been both altar and hearth, both sanctuary and gathering hall. And so we rest with this image. Temples not only as silent monuments to distant gods, but as places where people lived their togetherness, where survival and celebration met, where ritual and daily life were folded into one. We cannot know the exact rhythms, but we can feel the quiet continuity of life sustained within stone. We pause here, gently aware of this closeness of the ordinary and the sacred, before moving softly onward. What if we pause to think of the temples, not only as spaces of ritual and gathering, but also as living markers of identity, anchors that told communities who they were and where they belonged? On small islands surrounded by sea, where horizons stretch endlessly and storms can shift paths, stone temples rising from the ground may have been more than buildings. They may have been declarations of permanence, of rootedness, of shared self. The context of identity in early communities is both delicate and profound. Without written names, without flags or borders, people expressed belonging through shared acts, through monuments, through memory carried in stone. To build together was to define a group. To return season after season to the same place was to remind each generation that they were part of a chain, not scattered, not alone. In Malta, the sheer scale of construction, repeated across multiple sites, suggests a collective effort larger than family or village. These temples may have been symbols of unity, visible from afar, standing against time and weather as quiet affirmations of who the builders were. Now we must pause gently on what we do not know. We cannot say how these communities named themselves, or whether they saw themselves as one people or as many groups. The stones do not tell us of languages spoken, of alliances formed, of boundaries marked. Yet the repetition of similar architecture, the persistence of building style across centuries, implies a shared vision, a cultural thread that tied distant valleys and coasts together. The language of traces here is quiet but steady. Across Malta, the same spiral motifs appear, carved in stone by hands separated by distance, but united in design. Temples echo one another in plan, with curved chambers and aligned doorways. Radiocarbon dates suggest overlapping use across centuries, pointing to continuity rather than rupture. These are the indirect markers of identity, showing that a shared cultural pattern was carried across time and space. Let us try a gentle thought experiment. Step 1. A group gathers to build, stone by stone, sweat shared in labor. In the act of building, they define themselves as part of something larger. Step 2. As the temple stands, it becomes not only a place for ritual, but also a symbol, a reminder of effort, of belonging. Step 3. Generations later, descendants stand before the same stones. They may not remember the names of the first builders, but they know that these stones are theirs, part of their story. Identity is carried not through writing, but through enduring architecture. We must remain cautious. Temples may also have served as symbols of difference, marking one group's claim distinct from another. Identity can unite, but it can also separate. We cannot know whether these structures unified all of Malta's people or represented certain communities more strongly than others. The stones speak of shared patterns, but they do not tell us of rivalries or divisions. Now we pause for a softer reflection. Identity, in many forms, is about continuity. To see ourselves mirrored in what endures is to feel less fragile, less passing. For the temple builders, identity may not have been abstract, but tangible, held in stone, in spiral carvings, in rituals repeated beneath the same walls. The temples, in this sense, were not only sacred but social, not only about gods but about people, not only about eternity but about belonging here and now. And so, we rest with this image. Temples standing as anchors of identity, shaping community, binding generations. We cannot know the exact words they spoke about themselves, but we can sense the quiet certainty that to build in stone was to say, "We are here. We remain." We pause here, gently aware of this thread of identity, before moving softly onward. What if we allow ourselves to see the temples, not just as monuments of stone, but also as vessels of silence, holding within them the long echo of human presence that has now faded? When we walk among the ruins today, what greets us is not sound but quiet, not ceremony but absence. And yet this quiet is not empty. It is full of traces, full of faint signals left by those who once gathered here. The silence itself has become an archive, telling us of endurance, of disappearance, of time flowing on. The context of this silence stretches across millennia. The temples rose thousands of years before the pyramids, flourished for centuries, and then gradually were left behind. What we meet now is their afterlife, their state of survival as ruins. No fires burn in their altars, no chants rise through their doorways. Yet the stones remain, and with them, questions that are never fully answered. They are witnesses, mute but enduring, to human hands and human lives now long gone. Let us pause gently on what we do not know. We do not know the last ceremony held here. We do not know the moment when the stones fell silent, whether it was sudden or gradual, peaceful or troubled. We cannot hear their voices. We can only trace patterns left in soil, in bone, in scattered tools. Absence of sound is not absence of life, but it does leave us with uncertainty, a quiet space we cannot fill. The language of traces here is written in layers. Stones toppled and covered by earth, then uncovered again. Bones placed carefully, then scattered by time. Pollen grains preserved in soil, telling of plants once near. Charcoal fragments, remnants of fire, still marking where people warmed themselves or cooked. These traces whisper faintly through the silence, reminders that what is quiet now was once full of movement and sound. Let us try a thought experiment, gentle and slow. Step 1. Imagine the last people who tended these temples. Perhaps they repaired a wall, perhaps they lit a fire. Step 2. Over time, fewer came, until finally no one returned. The doors were left open, the stones left to wind and rain. Step 3. Centuries passed. What was once a gathering place became landscape, remembered only in fragments, until rediscovered much later. The silence, growing over time, became the most enduring presence of all. We must remain cautious. It is easy to imagine abandonment as decline, but perhaps the people moved on with purpose, carrying their rituals elsewhere. Perhaps the silence is not failure, but transformation. We cannot say. What we know is only what endures. The stones, the soil, the absence of voices. Now we pause for a softer reflection. Silence is not only loss, but also space for listening. To stand in the temples today is to stand within layers of time, to feel the weight of what is past, and to hear not words, but echoes. These echoes invite us to imagine, to connect, to sense continuity between then and now. And so, we rest with this thought. The silence of Malta's temples is not empty. It is filled with memory, with traces, with quiet endurance. It reminds us that time moves on, that voices fade, but that stones, in their stillness, keep watch. We pause here, gently aware of this enduring quiet, before moving softly onward. What if we pause at the very end, not to close the story of the temples, but to leave it open, as the stones themselves remain open to the sky? These monuments were raised thousands of years before the pyramids, by hands we cannot name, for purposes we can only glimpse. Yet they still stand, weathered yet enduring, silent yet eloquent. They remind us that time is vast, and that human traces can outlast memory, can become part of the landscape itself. The context of this reflection is long. The temples were built more than 5,000 years ago, flourished for many centuries, and then fell quiet. Since then, storms, soil, and the slow patience of time have worked upon them. And yet, they remain. In the span of human history, many empires have risen and fallen. But these stones, set in place by people without writing, without metal tools as we know them, continue to stand. They are not complete, not perfect, but present. They remind us of the endurance of matter and of the fragility of memory. Now we must pause gently on what we do not know. We cannot know the faces of the builders, their languages, their daily thoughts. We cannot know what prayers they spoke, or what dreams they carried. We do not know why the temples were abandoned, or how those who came later remembered them, if at all. We hold fragments, but the fullness is beyond us. Absence of evidence is not absence of meaning. It is simply the quiet limit of what the stones allow us to see. The language of traces here is wide and subtle. Radiocarbon dates sketch a timeline, but not a story. Soil cores preserve pollen, telling of landscapes once green, now changed. Bones speak of lives lived, illnesses endured, injuries healed. Carvings whisper patterns of spirals and animals, echoes of ideas that crossed centuries. Each trace is incomplete, yet together they weave a fabric that is fragile but still visible, stretched thin across millennia. Let us try a thought experiment, gentle and slow. Step 1. Imagine the builders, carrying stone, shaping chambers, carving spirals. They do not know that their work will endure for 5,000 years. They build for their own lives, their own rituals. Step 2. Centuries pass. Their descendants walk among the stones, perhaps with pride, perhaps with indifference. The original meaning shifts, but the stones remain part of the landscape. Step 3. Millennia pass. We arrive, strangers to their world, walking carefully among the ruins, searching for meaning in silence. The temples are still present, though those who built them are long gone. In this way, the stones outlive memory, yet invite new memory to form. We must remain cautious. It is easy to romanticize endurance, to imagine an unbroken line between them and us. In truth, what remains is fragmentary, and much has been lost. Yet what does endure invites us to reflect not only on the past, but also on the future. Our own traces, too, will someday be fragments, scattered and partial. Now we pause for a softer reflection. The temples remind us that time is not only about loss, but also about continuity. They are both ancient and present, both mysterious and familiar. To stand among them is to feel both small and connected, part of a longer rhythm. Perhaps that is their final gift, not answers, but perspective, a quiet reminder of scale. And so, we rest with this image. The stones of Malta standing under sun and wind, their silence holding memory, their endurance carrying presence. We cannot know the whole story, but we can walk gently among what remains, aware of time's vastness and of our place within it. If this rhythm feels close to us, we know what to do. We pause here softly, leaving the story open, as the stones themselves remain open to the sky.